It was supposed to be routine, a harmless little pit stop on Meghan Markle's long legal journey, the kind of appeal hearing that usually passes unnoticed in the endless paperwork of the justice system. Instead, September 9th turned into a stage, and Meghan's carefully curated image was the absent star of a show she never wanted to see performed. The courtroom stripped of royal glamour, and Netflix lighting suddenly resembled a surgical theater where her legal strategy was dissected piece by piece under unforgiving fluorescent light. The most devastating blow didn't come from Samantha Markle or even her lawyer, it came from the bench. Judge William Pryor leaned forward, eyebrows raised like a schoolteacher ready to humiliate a lazy student, and dropped the line that froze the room. "Your arguments are beside the point." In that one sentence, the oxygen seemed to vanish. Reporters scribbled furiously, the defense team's faces drained of color, and the gallery buzzed with the realization that Meghan's lawyers had just been cut off at the knees. No rebuttal could erase the sting of that phrase. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a public demotion of Meghan's entire legal apparatus. The irony, of course, was almost too delicious for the tabloids. Meghan, the woman who has built an empire on controlling the narrative, wasn't even in the room to spin this one. For years, she's mastered the art of positioning herself as the director of her own drama, choosing when to speak, when to reveal, when to vanish. Yet here, in the one arena where spin is worthless and only arguments matter, her absence screamed louder than any speech. The optics were brutal. A duchess known for commanding the spotlight reduced to a silent figure whose legal team stumbled without her. It was as though Meghan had written a script where she remained the untouchable lead, only to discover that someone else had hijacked the production. In this case, the hijacker was reality itself, and reality doesn't take notes from a PR consultant. The courtroom became a stage where she was mocked by silence, undermined by a single judicial phrase, and portrayed as a figure unwilling or unable to stand by her own narrative. And so the myth cracked. Meghan's aura of control, the polished image of a woman who always seemed 2 steps ahead of the game, began to look fragile, even hollow. Her absence wasn't interpreted as strategic detachment, but as avoidance. To those watching, it was the first sign that the Duchess, once seen as a master manipulator of perception, might actually be afraid of perception itself. A different curtain lifted that day, and the spotlight swung to someone few had expected to dominate the scene: Samantha Markle and her legal pit bull, Peter Tickton. While Meghan's lawyers drowned in a sea of convoluted explanations, Tickton cut through the fog with a scalpel. His strategy was deceptively simple: don't overwhelm the judge with theatrics, just expose the mess on the other side. And expose it he did methodically, mercilessly, with the precision of a surgeon who enjoys his work a little too much. Tickton's most lethal weapon wasn't new evidence or a fiery speech. It was a single phrase that landed like a grenade in the middle of the courtroom. Meghan's defense, he said, was nothing more than a smorgasbord of arguments. A buffet of desperation, cobbled together with no cohesion, no elegance, just a frantic grab bag of excuses. Within minutes, that phrase leapt from the dry transcript to the front pages, replayed in headlines, mocked in podcasts, turned into memes on TikTok. Meghan's team, who had once been praised for their sophistication, were suddenly reduced to a joke. It was the kind of linguistic assassination that lawyers dream of, and PR nightmares are made of. What made the contrast sharper was how little Tickton seemed to need. No battalion of advisors, no glossy PR machine, just a clear voice pointing out the obvious contradictions. Meghan's lawyers came armed with a $1 million toolkit and ended up looking like they'd brought IKEA instructions to a duel. Tickton, in comparison, resembled a Michelin-starred chef. He didn't need a cluttered kitchen. One sharp knife was enough to carve the whole roast, and Samantha, the half-sister, long dismissed as irrelevant, bitter, or merely opportunistic, suddenly found herself in a position of vindication. With Tickton at her side, she wasn't just the estranged relative anymore, she was a litigant backed by the kind of legal clarity Meghan's camp could only envy. The tables had turned and the symbolism was brutal. Meghan's carefully curated brand of invincibility was being dismantled, not by a head of state, not by a hostile government, not even by the press she so often blamed, but by her own family member and a lawyer with an eye for weak spots. By the time the session adjourned, the phrase smorgasbord of arguments had already become a viral shorthand for Meghan's crumbling defense. What was meant to be her team's shield had become the punchline of the day. It was a reminder, perhaps, that sometimes the sharpest blows in a courtroom aren't delivered by evidence, but by words, short, stinging, unforgettable words. All eyes were locked on the case now, and the courtroom tension thickened as the battle shifted into far more dangerous territory. What began as a war of words, an argument over statements, reputations, and who said what, suddenly transformed into something heavier, something with real world consequences. Samantha Markle and her team no longer framed this as a petty defamation squabble. Instead, they placed before the court evidence that pointed to tangible harm. Police reports of death threats, records of online harassment, and chilling data correlations between the timing of Meghan's most high-profile appearances, her sit-down with Oprah, the grand unveiling of the Netflix series, and spikes of abuse hurled towards Samantha. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about survival, about how celebrity influence can spill out of the screen and turn into a weapon in the hands of strangers. The phrase that began to circulate in legal commentary was influencer harassment, the idea that a star, knowingly or not, can unleash swarms of followers like hornets upon their target. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. Meghan, who for years positioned herself as the victim of merciless press attacks, now found herself painted as the instigator of a different kind of attack. In the new narrative, she wasn't the hunted but the hunter, or at least the spark that lit a mob. To the watching world, this inversion was both shocking and tantalizing. The woman who once spoke about surviving toxic fame was now accused of weaponizing that very fame against her own family. It was a framing that cut deep, not just legally but culturally. The court wasn't simply evaluating if Meghan had told a mistruth in an interview. It was being asked to consider whether her words had become a call to arms, whether the power of a celebrity can mutate into something akin to a digital riot. Suddenly, the trial wasn't just about Meghan Markle, it became a referendum on influencer culture itself, on the blurred line between speech and incitement. Every revelation tightened the knot around Meghan's image. Where she once stood as the face of resilience against a hostile press, Samantha's evidence painted her as a celebrity with blood on her hands, not literally but through the chaos her influence allegedly unleashed. And in that courtroom, the silence following each disclosure was deafening. It was as though every spectator, every journalist, every analyst felt the same realization settle. In this was no longer just a courtroom drama. It was the birth of a precedent. If there were an Oscar for sheer incompetence, Meghan's legal team would be polishing their acceptance speech right now. What unfolded inside that federal courtroom was less a display of strategy and more a tragicomedy, a live broadcast of a meltdown that no PR consultant could ever spin. The very lawyers tasked with protecting Meghan's reputation admitted to skipping over basic procedures and omission so glaring it bordered on self-sabotage. The collapse wasn't subtle. Observers described the session as a federal courtroom mess, the kind of phrase that doesn't just sting in the moment, but lingers forever in the public record. Once such a label attaches itself, it becomes permanent ink, impossible to scrub from the archives. Meghan's carefully maintained persona as the hyper-controlled media-savvy Duchess could not survive the sight of her legal guardians fumbling in front of a federal judge. What made it worse was the contrast between expectation and reality. Meghan has long been framed as the mastermind of her own brand, a woman who orchestrates every angle of the camera, every headline, every word that leaves her mouth. But inside the courtroom, that image shattered. The empire of control dissolved into chaos. The lawyers who should have reflected her famed discipline instead looked like amateur actors stumbling through forgotten lines. It was almost cinematic, except this wasn't a drama Meghan had scripted. Imagine a director who insists on absolute creative control, only to discover that her cast is improvising badly missing cues and collapsing under the stage lights. That was Meghan's defense team performers in the wrong genre, turning what was meant to be a courtroom defense into something closer to a slapstick sitcom. Even Meghan's absence took on a new, more sinister shade. At first, it might have seemed like aloof confidence, a royal detachment from the muck of legal warfare. But as her lawyers unraveled, her failure to appear looked less like strategy and more like cowardice. She wasn't just absent from the room, she was absent from accountability. And that absence became the exclamation point on the spectacle of incompetence. In the end, no amount of glossy PR, no carefully timed Netflix cameo, no podcast soundbite could erase what happened that day. The meltdown was recorded, transcribed, and entered into federal archives. Long after the gossip fades, this courtroom fiasco will remain a black mark and unflattering script that Meghan never wanted performed yet, one that the world can replay forever. This was the moment everyone had to hold their breath. What started as a courtroom skirmish now rippled far beyond the legal arena, sending shockwaves through Hollywood boardrooms and royal corridors alike. For Meghan, the fallout wasn't confined to transcripts and headlines. It seeped into her brand, her deals, her very aura of untouchability. Executives in Los Angeles, once eager to package the Duchess as a marketable symbol of resilience and reinvention, quietly began adding new clauses to their contracts. Risk assessments shifted. Where Meghan once represented glamour and prestige, she was now seen as legal volatility, a liability who could drag a project into the swamp of litigation with one wrong step. Producers, investors, even brand partners who had been circling her name were suddenly retreating, calculating that no amount of star power was worth the shadow of a courtroom fiasco. Harry, too, couldn't escape the collateral damage. For months, he had been trying to sketch out an identity independent of his wife, experimenting with projects that might give him credibility outside the Sussex brand. But when Meghan is branded as a PR disaster, the taint inevitably spreads. The narrative was no longer about their shared victimhood or bold independence. It was about whether the couple themselves had become toxic assets in an industry where reputation is currency. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the royal family remained silent. No statement, no gesture, no gloating smile. But within palace walls, there was said to be a quiet sense of vindication. The woman who once rocked their institution, who dragged them into the harshest spotlight in decades, was now unraveling under a spotlight of her own making. To the public, the symbolism was irresistible. Meghan Markle, once armored by a carefully cultivated narrative, was suddenly exposed as vulnerable to the same forces she claimed to fight against. The harsh truth was undeniable. Meghan's greatest strength had always been her ability to shape the story, to bend perception in her favor, to command attention on her terms. But in this case, she had lost that power. The story was being told for her, and it wasn't flattering. The most dangerous outcome wasn't the verdict of the court, but the collapse of her aura, that shimmering illusion of being beyond reach, beyond criticism, beyond consequence. Once that shield cracked, the precedent was set. If Samantha Markle could drag the Duchess into a courtroom and land blows that stuck what was stopping others from following Meghan's nightmare, wasn't one lawsuit, it was the open season that might come after. The Duchess, once untouchable, had become touchable, and in the ruthless worlds of law, media, and celebrity, nothing is more fatal than losing the illusion of invincibility.